Imperium, The Philosophy of History and Politics, Part 2, Chapter 2, The War Politics Symbiosis. We come to the relation of war to politics. It is not proposed to treat of the metaphysics of war, but to develop a practical outlook of the possibilities and necessities of war to serve as a basis for action. First, a definition. War is an armed struggle between organized political units. It is not a question of the method of fighting, for weapons are merely a way of killing, nor of military organization. These things determine nothing about the inner nature of war. War is the highest possible expression of the friend-enemy disjunction. It confers the practical meaning on the word enemy. The enemy is he upon whom one is preparing to make, or upon whom one is making, war. If there is no question of war, he is not an enemy. He may be a mere opponent in a contest for a prize. He may be a mere heathen, a mere ideological opponent, a competitor, a hateful thing for reasons of antipathy. The minute he becomes an enemy, the possibility or actuality of armed struggle, war, enters. War is not an agon, and thus the armed struggles among the states of the Western culture up to the middle of the 18th century were not wars in the 20th century meaning of the word. They were limited in their object and scope, and, vis-a-vis the opponent, they were not existential. Thus, they were not political in the 20th century meaning of the word. They were not fought against enemies in our sense of the term. Unfortunately, our Western languages lack the precision which Greek had in this respect to distinguish between intra-Hellenic struggles, agons, with the opponent, the antagonist, on the one hand, and wars against the non-culture member, on the other hand, in which the opponent, e.g., the Persian, was the enemy. The Crusades were thus war in the full, unlimited sense of the word. The deep spiritual objective was the assertion of the cultural superiority and of the true faith against the heathen. The opponent, though one naturally extended personal magnanimity to his soldiers because of the inner imperative of chivalrous honor, was an enemy, not to be allowed to continue in his unity if it could be destroyed. Honor in the Crusades forbade personal meanness, but did not exclude total destruction of the enemy organized unit. Honor in intra-European struggles did forbid imposing too harsh a treaty upon the defeated opponent, and it entered no one's mind to deny the opponent the right to existence as an organized unit. During the history of our culture, from Pope Gregory VII to Napoleon, the struggle against a member of the culture was limited, but that against the heathen, the non-member of the culture, was true, unlimited war. Wars before, after, and outside a culture are unlimited. They are a more pure expression of the barbarian in man, in that they are not highly symbolic. They are spiritual, for everything human is spiritual. The spirit is primary with man. The material is the vehicle of the spiritual development. Man sees symbolic significance in that around him. His experiencing of these symbols and his acting and organizing in accordance are what make him man, even though he carry within him also the animal instincts. His soul, of course, with its transforming symbolism, completely changes the expression of these instincts. They pass into the service of the soul and its symbolism. Man does not kill, like a tiger, for food to eat. He kills because of spiritual necessity. Not even wars entirely outside a culture are purely animal, entirely devoid of symbolic content. With man, that would be impossible. Only something spiritual can bring masses onto a battlefield. But the symbolism of a high culture is a grand symbolism. It links past, present, and future, and the totality of things, dissolving them all into a magnificent performance, of which it is later realized that that too was a symbol. It is only in comparison with these grand meanings, this grand superpersonal destiny, that extracultural human phenomena seem merely zoological. Thus, because of their lower symbolic content, lower spiritual potential, These wars can never approach the intensity, scale, or duration of wars connected with a high culture. Defeat is acknowledged much more easily, for it is only the souls of those engaged that are affected. In cultural wars, however, the soul of the culture is at work, lending its invisible but invincible strength to those in its service, and a struggle can be maintained for years against fearful odds. A few defeats, and all would have been up with Genghis Khan. Not so with Friedrich der Grosse or George Washington, for they felt themselves to be the vehicle of an idea, of the future. There cannot be said to exist an enmity unless the possibility of war is present. A possibility in fact, not a mere conceivability. Nor need possibility be daily and imminent, nor need the door be closed on negotiations before the possibility of war, and therefore true enmity can be said to exist. Not even among warlike states is life a daily bloodshed. War is the highest possible intensification of politics, but there must also be something less intense, the period of recuperating, negotiating, steering, preparing. Without the fact of peace, we would not have the word war, and, what the pacifists have never thought of, without war we could not have peace, in the blissful, dreamy, saccharine way they use the word. All the fierce energy that war devotes to superpersonal struggles would go into domestic discord of one sort or another, and the casualty list would hardly be less. The relation of war to politics is clear. Clausewitz, in the usually misquoted passage, called war the continuation of political intercourse by other means. Usually misquoted because it does not mean that the military fighting is the continuation of politics, for this it is not. Fighting has its own strategic and tactical grammar. It has its own organic rules and imperatives. War does not have, however, a motivation of its own. This is supplied by politics. As is the intensity of the political struggle, i.e., of the enmity, so is the war. It was insight into this interrelationship that prompted an English diplomat to say that a politician was better trained for fighting than the soldier, for he fights continually and the soldier only occasionally. It is also observable that professional soldiers would turn a war into an agon before political soldiers would. The phrase political soldier is only ad hoc, to designate anyone fighting from conviction rather than from profession. Clausewitz expressed in the same chapter a description of this relationship between politics and war that has validity in this century. As war belongs to politics, so does it take on its character. When politics becomes grand and powerful, so does the war, which can ascend to the height where it attains to its absolute form. War presupposes politics, just as politics presupposes war. Politics determines the enemy, and the time of opening the war. These are not problems for the soldier. Armies must be prepared to fight any political unit. War and politics cannot be defined in terms of mutual aim or purpose. It makes no organic sense to say that war is the aim of politics, or politics of war. It could not be in either case. Each is the prerequisite of the other. Neither could exist without the other. A given policy could aim at a certain war, naturally, but no politics could possibly aim at war in general. It is the eventuality of war which gives to political thinking its hallmark, that makes it a different form of thinking from, say, economic thinking, moral, scientific, or aesthetic thinking. Imperium, Part 2, Chapter 2, Section 2. The disjunction of friend-enemy being the essence of political thinking and acting. Is this to say that there is nothing between? No, for neutrality exists as a fact. It has its own rules and conditions of existence. The Western culture developed as a part of its international law, a law governing neutrality. The very formulation of these rules for neutrals shows that the decisive thing is the conflict, the friend-enemy disjunction. The problem for a neutral is how to keep out. It is not the problem of the others, in the usual case, how to keep the neutral out. The whole practice of the law of neutrality was dependent upon who was at war. If the great powers were at war, neutrals had, as a matter of practice, few rights. If small powers were engaged in a war, and the great powers were neutral, neutrals had many rights. But the essential thing is that neutrality as a policy stands in the shade of the practical possibility of war and active politics. For a country to become neutral as a form of existence would be to cease to exist as a political unit. It might continue to exist economically, socially, culturally, but politically it could not exist if it were neutral. To renounce war is to renounce the right to an enemy. As long as a power is committed to war in any one given eventuality, it has not adopted total neutrality. Thus, Belgium's neutrality during the 19th century was only a word, and not a fact, for it maintained an army, diplomatic representation abroad, and it entered into military understandings with France and England against Germany. As long as a country maintains an army, it cannot say its basic national policy is neutrality. An army is an instrument of politics, even if only of politics of self-defense. Politics and neutrality exclude one another, as do neutrality and continued existence. Here again, another instance of the polemical nature of all political language. Neutrality was turned into a polemical word by certain small countries of Europe. Actually, by their very existence, they were serving the political purpose of one half of Europe against the other half. This position of being committed by their very existence to one side of a struggle they called neutrality. They knew their politics would involve them in war. They knew on which side they would be, and when the war did come, they cried aloud that their neutrality had been violated. To renounce politics, which is what total neutrality means, is to renounce existence as a unit. In many cases, it is the part of wisdom and the dictates of culture to amalgamate with another power, to renounce an empty existence as a unit, an existence without a meaning or a future. In addition to neutrality as a precarious fact, during war, and neutrality as a polemical fraud, there is neutrality which arises from the hopelessness of carrying on a war successfully. This is closer to true neutrality, for what it means is that powers reduced to such a case have disappeared from the calculations of the other powers, unless of course the land in question is attractive as spoils or as a battlefield. In this case, it must choose for itself to which of the powers still in the struggle it will surrender its independence. If it fails to do this, the choice will be made for it. A power which by its economic weakness, small size, or age cannot possibly carry on a war has in effect renounced war and become neutral. Whether it is allowed to continue a posthumous existence depends entirely on how attractive its domains are. For purposes of high politics, it is not a political, but a neutral factor. From the development of colossal war techniques came the fact that few powers can support or wage a war. This led the rationalists and liberals, ever bright with a new wish-informed thought, to announce that the world was becoming pacified. No more war or politics. Power politics is their word, just as one could talk of beauty aesthetics, utile economics, good morality, piety religion, legal law. The world has become neutral. The occasions of war are going. Political powers can no longer afford wars, and the like. It is not war or politics which is disappearing. It is only that the number of contestants has grown less. A pacified world would be one in which there was no politics. It would thus be one where no human difference could possibly arise, which could range men against one another as enemies. In a purely economic world, men could be opposed, but only as competitors. If morality was also there, the proponents of different theories could oppose one another, but only in discussion. Religionists could oppose one another, but only with the propaganda of their respective faiths. It would have to be a world in which there was no one who would kill, or better yet, such a languid, colorless, and boring world that no one could possibly take anything seriously enough to kill or risk his life about it. The only conclusion to be drawn is that a rationalist, liberal, or pacifist who believes that it is possible for war to vanish simply does not understand what the word war means, its reciprocal existence with politics, or the nature of politics as the ranging of men against one another as enemies. In other words, and in the kindliest words possible, these people do not know what they are talking about. They wish to abolish war by politics, or even by war. If war were gone, and politics remained, they would then abolish politics by war, or perhaps by politics. They confuse verbal virtuosity with political thinking, logic with soul necessities, accident with history. As for superpersonal forces, they do not exist, because they cannot be seen, weighed, and measured. Imperium Part 2, Chapter 2, Section 3. Since the symbiosis of war and politics forms its own thought category, independent of other ways of thinking, it follows that a war could not be carried on from a purely non-political motive. If a religious difference, an economic contrast, an ideological disjunction, were to reach the degree of intensity of feeling at which it would range men against one another as enemies, it would thereby become political. And such units as formed would be political units and would be guided by a political way of maneuvering, thinking, and valuing, and not by a religious, economic, or other way of thinking. Pure economics could not possibly wage a war, for war does not pay economically. Pure religion could not wage a war, nor pure ideology, because war cannot spread religion, cannot convert, but can only result in an accretion or diminution of power. Motives other than strictly political ones can indeed actuate a war, but the war takes them up into itself, and they vanish into it. Western Christianity has motivated wars, such as the Crusades, but these wars did not let loose the forces upon which Christianity places a positive value. Economics has motivated wars, but the immediate result of a war has never been a profit. For this reason, the liberals and rationalists comfortably convinced themselves before 1914 that war had vanished because it did not show a profit. They were moving in their private world of abstraction, where economics was the sole motive of human conduct, and where invisible superpersonal forces did not exist. And 1914 did not cause them to change their theory. No, where the facts and theory conflict, it is the facts which need revision. 1914 caused them to re-implement their theory. The First World War was all the more proof of their viewpoint, for it showed that it was economically necessary that war disappear. These people did not know that economic necessity of human beings is never taken into account by superpersonal forces. Could they get no clue from the statement of one of the most immediate participants in the feverish flurry of negotiations of July 1914, that all the statesmen concerned merely drifted into the war? A strictly factual view shows that superpersonal organisms have no economics in our sense of the word, for they are purely spiritual. When culture populations nourish themselves, and that is what economics is, they are nourishing the higher organism, for the populations are its cells. Its cells are to the superpersonal soul as the cells of a human body are to the human soul. A war from purely religious, economic, or other motives would be senseless as well as impossible. From religious contrasts arise the thought categories of believer and non-believer. From economics, those of co-worker and competitor. From ideological, those of agreeer and disagreeer. Only from political contrast come friend-enemy groupings, and only from enmity can come war. The enmity can start elsewhere. The personal distaste of the mistress of a ruler has brought about an enmity grouping among Western states. But when it comes to enmity, it is politics. Although the enmity may have started on a religious contrast, when it comes to war, one will fight against believers, or accept the help of non-believers. Only the 30 Years' War need be mentioned in this connection. Though economics be the beginning of the enmity, once it rises to the intensity of enmity, one fights without regard to the economic consequences of his fighting, but only to the political consequences. Other thought categories claim they should have a monopoly of thinking, that the political should be subject to them. The 20th century outlook on politics merely observes that they do not as a matter of fact. From an aesthetic standpoint, war and politics may be ugly. From an economic, wasteful. From the moral, wicked. From the religious, sinful. These viewpoints, however, are neutral from the political standpoint, which tries first to assess the facts and second to change them, but never tries to value them according to a non-political scheme of values. Some politicians do this, it is true. English politicians in particular, after Cromwell, felt an inner compulsion to present every one of their wars as somehow directly involving Christianity. Even a war which planted the hammer and sickle in the heart of Europe was a war for Christianity. But this does not affect what I am saying here, as this sort of thing only affects vocabulary, but does not touch facts or action. Using a non-political terminology or propaganda cannot depoliticize politics, any more than using a pacifist terminology can debellicize war. Politicians are usually not pure in their thinking any more than other men. Even a saint commits sins. Even a scientist has his private superstitions. Even a divine may have his little taints of mechanism. Even a liberal may have his minuscule trace of animal instinct, which, if released, may cause a sanguinary war, after the conclusion of which he may try to exterminate the human beings comprising the population of the former enemy. Just as a war cannot, as a matter of fact, be purely economic, religious, or moral, it follows that a war need not qualify under any other category in order to be justifiable from the political standpoint. The scholastic philosophers set forth the ethico-religious prerequisites of a just war. St. Thomas Aquinas formulated them in a fashion which is final for ethico-religious thought. From the political standpoint, however, the test of the justification is quite different. It is of course obvious that the word justification is inadequate, since this word belongs originally to moral thinking and not to political thinking. It must therefore not be interpreted as an invasion of the field of morality if the word justification is used in this connection, for what is meant is appropriateness, desirability, advantageousness, and indeed these are contained in the secondary meaning of the word justification. Now, in this practical, political sense, what wars are justified? Politics is activity in regard to power. Units engaged in politics may gain or lose power. Instinct and understanding direct them to seek to increase power. War is the most intense method of trying to increase power. Thus, a war which has no practically foreseeable possibility of increasing power is not politically justifiable. A war which promises an increase in power is politically justifiable. This is what the word success means in this connection, i.e., that increased power is the result of the war. When diminished power is the result of the war was unsuccessful. Imperium, Part 2, Chapter 2, Section 4. The words defeat and victory thus divide into two sharply and precisely defined sets of meaning, the military and the political. Although the armies in the field may be on the winning side, nevertheless, the unit to which they supposedly belong may emerge from the war with less power than when it entered upon it. I say supposedly belong for the reason that when a political unit is in the situation where even military victory means political defeat, it is not in political reality an independent unit. Thus, if there were only two powers in the world, the one gaining the military victory in a war would of necessity gain the political victory. There is no second possibility. But if there were more than two powers engaged in a war, and a military victory was gained, one or more powers must have gained the political victory, i.e., must have increased in power. Thus, if any power, despite the fact that it was on the winning side in a military sense, nevertheless emerged with less power, it was in fact fighting for the political victory of another power. In other words, it was not actually an independent unit, but was in the service of another unit. To be specific instead of general, after the First World War, England, although on the side of the victorious in a military sense, was weaker in the political sense, i.e., it had less power afterwards than before the war. In the War of the Spanish Succession, France emerged from the war weaker than it had entered, despite the fact that it had gained the military victory. But between these two sets of meanings of the words victory and defeat, there is an order of rank. The political meaning is primary, for war itself is subsidiary to politics. Any politician would prefer a military defeat coupled with political victory to the converse. Despite the military defeat of France in the Napoleonic Wars, Talleyrand negotiated a political victory for France out of the Congress of Vienna. To say that a unit gained a military victory and also suffered a political defeat is only another way of saying that the military opponent was not a real enemy. A real enemy is he whom one can strike down and thereby increase one's own power. It is for the politician to determine whom to fight, and if he selects as the enemy a unit at whose expense no power can possibly be gained, even in a militarily successful war, that politician was incapable. He may be merely stupid. He may be carrying on a private parasite politics, using the lives of his countrymen to implement his personal antipathies, like Graf Brühl in the 7 Years' War. He may be a distorter, representing an outer force not belonging to the nation, or even to the culture. Such a politician may also be a traitor, who sells himself for a private economic consideration, like the Poles, who disappeared upon the outbreak of war in 1939, and were never heard of again. But regardless of why a politician chooses for an enemy a unit which was not a real enemy, the fact remains that in doing so he is abdicating the sovereignty of his state and placing it therewith in the service of another state. The classic example of this in recent history is, of course, England's participation in the Second World War. England was on the victorious side in the military sense, but sustained a total defeat in the political sense. Already during the war, a member of the English Parliament was able to announce that apparently England was a dependency of America. At the conclusion of that war, England's power and prestige had sunk so low that it had to abandon the empire. Extra-European forces were the victors. England had fought in the Second World War and had given lives and positions for the political victory of others. It was not the first time in history, nor will it be the last, but because of its magnitude, it will always remain the classic example. A tiny island of some 242,000 quadrate kilometers, with only 40 million population. Nevertheless, England controlled in 1900 17/20ths of the surface of the earth. This includes all the seas, on which England was supreme in the sense that it could deny them to any other power. In less than 25 years, or after the First World War, 1914 to 1918, England found this sea supremacy gone, as well as its commercial primacy, and its position of arbiter of Europe in the sense that it could prevent any power taking first place. In less than 50 years, or after the Second World War, 1939 to 1945, all was gone. The empire and also the independence of the homeland. The lesson, of course, is that a structure built through centuries of war, bloodshed, and high political tradition of choosing always for an enemy him whose defeat would increase the empire of England, that this can be lost through 1 or 2 wars against a power not a real enemy. In 1939, even there could be no difference of opinion among political thinkers that England could not have an enemy in Europe, since the extra-European forces, Japan, Russia, and America, had become decisive in world politics. But in 1946, there could be no difference of opinion on this subject among human beings anywhere in the world, regardless of their ability or inability to think politically. Always excepting the liberals, of course, who move among theories and not among facts. Indeed, even after this disastrous war, liberals, distorters, and stupid persons in England continued to glory in the victory of England. From the political standpoint, the most hopeful fact for England's future in the period after the war was that the extra-European occupation forces were withdrawn from England. Thus, we have seen again the existential nature of organic alternatives. A unit can either fight a real enemy or it must lose. And again, a unit not fighting a real enemy is in the service of another power. There is no middle ground. If a unit is not fighting for itself, it is fighting against itself. The broadest formulation of this fundament is, an organism must be true to its own inner law of existence, or it will sicken and die. It is the inner law of a political organism that it must increase its own power. This is the only way it can behave toward power. If it tries to confer power on another organism, it injures itself. If it tries merely to prevent another organism from attaining power, it injures itself. If it gives up its complete existence to blocking another organism, quite regardless of its success in this negative aim, it will destroy itself. France, from 1871 onward, is an example of the latter. The whole idea of the existence of France as a state was to block and frustrate a neighboring state. The inspiriting slogan of this idea was revanche. The idea was pursued for decades, and in the process, French power was destroyed. The policy could not, of course, have arisen in a healthy organism.